The hall was restless with torchlight. Smoke gathered in the beams above, and the sound of 100 armored men shifted like an uneasy sea. At the center stood 9 thrones, not of gold, nor yet of iron, but carved from the stone of their homelands, dragged here for this night alone. Each king had brought his throne with pride, as if to remind the others that they ruled not by favor, but by blood, by conquest, by the voices of their people. The air stank of travel, of dust and horse sweat, of foreign incense carried across deserts, of salt still clinging to the cloaks of those who came from the coast. And yet, for all their noise, a silence began to spread. The stranger had entered. He wore no crown, carried no weapon, spoke no name. His robe was dark but shimmered like oil upon water. He moved as if the ground itself carried him forward. At first, none dared ask who he was. Kings were used to deference, not mystery, and yet the stranger's presence bent the room around him like heat bends a road. Only when he reached the circle of thrones did he speak. "You are rulers of men," he said, his voice calm, almost weary, as though truth required no effort. "And yet you are prisoners." The word struck like a blade drawn too quickly. A desert king, skin bronzed by years of war, rose with anger flashing in his eyes. "We are no man's prisoners," he spat. "We rule by the right of our swords, and by the will of our gods." The stranger turned his gaze, and the desert king faltered. For a heartbeat his anger drained, replaced by the sudden terror of being known too deeply. The stranger's eyes had no color, or rather, they carried all colors, shifting as though the world itself was reflected in them. "You are prisoners of time," he said softly. "Your swords dull. Your gods grow silent. Your cities flourish and fade. You build, and death takes it all." A murmur ran through the hall. Even the proudest king felt a tremor in his chest, though none admitted it. Because every man there, beneath his crown, beyond his guard, feared the same enemy. Time. The stranger smiled then, not kindly, but with the ease of a man unveiling a hidden door. He raised his hand, and the torches bent as though drawn toward the glimmer of what he revealed. 9 rings. Each shone with its own hue, emerald like forest light, sapphire as deep as ocean dusk, amber like captured fire. They did not rest upon velvet, they seemed to float in his palm, humming faintly, as if the air itself strained to contain them. "These," the stranger said, "are keys. With them, no city you raise will crumble. No line you begin will end. No enemy will outlast your throne. You will reign not as men, but as kings beyond death." The room had changed. What had been noise and pride was now hunger, sharpened and raw. One by one, the kings leaned forward. The warrior from the mountains clenched his fist until his knuckles whitened. The Sea Lord tilted his head, hearing waves that were not there. The scholar king, who had spent his youth among scrolls, suddenly felt how fragile parchment was against centuries. It was the youngest among them who spoke first. His voice was steady, though his hands trembled. "What price?" The stranger regarded him as though pleased the question had been asked at all. "The price is nothing you do not already spend," he said. "Your will, your strength, your crown. All that you are will remain yours. I only give what time has stolen." The lie was perfect because it did not sound like one. The stranger moved among them, placing a ring before each throne. No king reached for his gift at once. Each stared at the circle of metal as though it contained his own reflection. For in truth, it did, not the face he wore now, but the one he would wear when years had withered him, when memory had scattered, when his crown had passed to weaker hands. And so it was not greed that guided them. It was fear. One by one, fingers closed around the rings. A hush fell over the hall, thicker than smoke, heavier than silence. Somewhere, far beyond the walls, a bell tolled midnight. The crowns of men gleamed in the torchlight, and at their bases, the new gold of 9 rings shone brighter still. The stranger's smile deepened. In the firelight his shadow lengthened, stretching until it touched the walls, then the beams, then the thrones themselves. For a moment, it seemed as if the shadow belonged not to him at all but to something vaster, waiting, patient, inevitable. 9 kings sat in their thrones, 9 rings upon their hands. And though they did not yet know it, the world had just changed. The days that followed were unlike any the world of men had known. At first, the rings seemed nothing less than miracles. Harvests ripened faster, as if the soil itself bent to their wearer's will. Ships cut across stormy seas without breaking mast or losing sail. Walls rose in record time, white stones stacked with a precision that stunned masons. Wherever a king strode, whispers followed, whispers that spoke of divine favor, of rulers blessed beyond measure. In every land, people celebrated. Markets swelled with grain, soldiers returned home with fewer wounds, poets compared their rulers to demigods. A hush of gratitude fell across kingdoms, and the Nine sat upon their thrones watching their legacies bloom. Yet what appeared as divine order to their subjects began to feel, within their own chests, like something stranger. The Mountain King was first to notice it. In the stillness of night, as he traced a finger along the jeweled band, he felt his breath deepen, his mind sharpen, and yet sleep fled from him. Hours stretched into dawn, and though his body did not ache, he rose hollow-eyed, restless, his wife stirring at the absence beside her. The Sea Lord, once a man of roaring laughter, found himself standing at the edge of the harbor long after his sailors had gone, staring out across the waves with a longing that had no name. He would stay there until the stars bled into morning, listening to the rush of tides that now seemed to answer him with whispers he could not quite decipher. The Scholar King, whose youth had been spent among tomes and the ink of forgotten languages, felt the gift differently. As he touched his ring, he could read whole passages in a glance, his memory flawless. But with every page devoured, he noticed his heart shrinking, his compassion thinning, as though knowledge was being purchased at the cost of warmth. His counselors complained that his decrees had grown cold, his judgments more precise than merciful. And the Desert King, proud, fierce, unbending, began to dream of endless horizons. In his visions, caravans stretched without end across dunes of fire, bearing treasures that had no weight. When he woke, he found himself clutching the ring so tightly that blood welled in his palm, the gold unmoved, perfect, unyielding. None of them spoke of these things. When they gathered in councils or in great halls, they wore their new certainty like armor. They spoke of bridges yet to be built, trade routes yet to be carved, empires that could be stretched beyond sight. Their voices rang with confidence, and their people believed them. Who could doubt the evidence? Where once a decade was needed to raise a fortress, now a season sufficed. Where once famine came every generation, now granaries overflowed. But beneath the splendor, there was a silence growing, the silence of men who no longer laughed as they once did, who no longer touched the hands of their children, who no longer needed sleep or solace. Their subjects noticed only faintly. A wife wondered why her king no longer sat beside her at feasts. A soldier remarked that his lord's eyes never blinked during long councils. Children whispered that their fathers seemed taller in shadow, colder when they entered a room. These were small things, dismissed as the weight of ruling. And yet, in the corners of their kingdoms, fear began to stir. A mason who built for the Mountain King swore that when he turned his back, the king's outlines seemed to blur, as though heat rose from stone in the middle of winter. A fisherman claimed the Sea Lord's reflection lingered upon the water long after he had turned away. Servants in the scholar's court reported that when they touched his books, their fingers grew numb, as though frost clung to parchment. Still, the kings dismissed these rumors. They could not afford to believe them. The rings had become too necessary. Without them, they felt weaker, dulled, half-men. To remove the band even for an hour was to taste despair. And so, they wore them always. In this gilded season, the world saw prosperity unmatched, but the kings themselves were already shifting. Their crowns still glittered in sunlight, their thrones still commanded respect, but their laughter was hollow, their warmth diminished. They had traded the ordinary fragility of men for something far more enduring, and in doing so, had begun the long drift away from their own humanity. Far to the east, unseen, a shadow stirred at the edge of mountains. Its patience was boundless. Its design had never been in question. For power given is never truly free, and the hand that grants it is always waiting to collect. The summons did not arrive as parchment or messenger. It came as a tremor in the rings themselves. On a night when the stars burned clear, each king woke at once, whether in palace or tent, on mountain ridge or in seaside tower. The rings upon their fingers pulsed, not with warmth, but with a chill that reached bone. It was not pain, but command. The command of something vast. The mountain king stumbled from his chamber, eyes clouded, servants fleeing before him as he muttered words in a tongue older than men. The Sea Lord dropped his goblet, watching the wine writhe on the floor as though pulled by tides unseen. The Scholar King, in the middle of dictating law, froze mid-sentence, ink spilling across parchment as his hand stiffened. They did not decide to rise. They were pulled. Across deserts and forests, across cities and plains, the nine moved as though sleepwalking, abandoning throne and kin. Horses screamed beneath them, driven to exhaustion. One king rode until his steed collapsed, then walked on foot without pause. Another vanished into shadow, his body shedding solidity as he crossed leagues in a heartbeat. For days they traveled, compelled by a will not their own, until the land itself grew scorched, until ash hung in the wind, until the mountain teeth of Mordor split the horizon. At last, they stood before the Black Gate. It opened for them. Inside the shadowed court of Barad-dûr, the air pressed against their lungs. The walls seemed alive, as if every stone had been carved from some great creature's ribcage. And there, rising from a dais black as obsidian, stood the stranger. But he was no stranger now. The fair visage they had once admired was gone, cast aside like a mask. In its place loomed a figure wreathed in armor and fire, his presence so immense it seemed to burn through the mind. Where eyes should have been, there was only a furnace glow, and where his voice had once been honey, now it was iron dragged across stone. "I gave you crowns beyond death," he said. "Did you think they were yours alone to wear?" The Desert King, bold even now, forced his voice into the suffocating air. "We took no oath to you." Sauron's gaze fell upon him, and the king's defiance crumbled. His body shook, his mouth opened in a scream without sound. He clawed at the ring, but it would not leave his hand. His crown slipped from his head and struck the floor, the echo sharp, final. When he rose again, he was silent, his eyes hollow. The others understood. Oath or not, the rings themselves were chains. Sauron stepped closer, towering, his voice filling the hall. "You will be my nine, my heralds, my hunters. Through you, fear will walk before my armies. Through you, hope will rot in the hearts of men." The Sea Lord fell to one knee, his body trembling not from loyalty but compulsion. One by one, the rest followed. Not by choice, by tether. Their crowns glimmered faintly in the red torchlight, symbols of kingdoms now abandoned. The transformation did not happen all at once. It was a peeling, a fading. Their flesh grew pale, then thin, until light itself seemed to pass through them. Voices that once rang like command now scraped like wine through broken glass. Their names, once carved in songs, in scrolls, in bloodlines, slipped away, forgotten even by those who had loved them. In their place new titles emerged: the Witch King, the Black Captain, the Ghost of the Dunes. They became less men and more presence, shadows clothed in armor, terror shaped into form. And yet, in the hollow spaces where their humanity had been, fragments of memory clung. A father remembered the curl of his child's hair, though he could not remember the child's name. A warrior saw in dreams the mountain spring he had drunk from as a boy. A scholar felt the phantom warmth of parchment under fingertips that no longer held substance. These memories burned like thorns, brief reminders of what they had surrendered. They wept without tears, screamed without sound, and rose as wraiths. When they emerged from Mordor, the world shifted. Villages fled at the mere rumor of them. Animals screamed when their shadows passed. Men who stood their ground found their courage drain away, as though their very spirits had been poured into the earth. The nine rode black steeds whose hooves struck fire, and when they moved together, it was like a storm front swallowing the horizon. The world had gained 9 kings undying, but it had lost 9 men. The Golden Age was over. The world remembered their return not as an event, but as a chill. The first sightings were whispers carried by terrified lips. A merchant in the south claimed he had seen 9 riders crossing the dunes, their cloaks unmoved by wind, their steeds never tiring. A shepherd in the north swore that shadows lingered on the hills after sunset, shapes with crowns faintly glowing like embers. In every story, the witnesses spoke of a silence that pressed against the heart, a silence so heavy it forced men to their knees. Where the 9 passed, villages emptied. Fields grew wild. Wells ran dry though water had not been touched. Children woke screaming from dreams they could not name. Yet behind the terror, there was pain. The Desert King, now called the Ghost of the Dunes, would sometimes pause at the edge of a fire-lit camp. He would stand unmoving while warriors trembled before him. But in the hollow space beneath his hood, fragments of memory stirred. A son's laughter. A bride's touch. They would flicker like sparks and then vanish, smothered by the will that bound him. The Scholar King, now robed in tattered black, still heard the echo of pages turning in his mind. In dark halls, while the others spoke of conquest, he would lift an invisible book and trace the air with fingers that no longer had flesh. He knew he was forgetting something precious, though he could not say what. These moments of yearning made their bondage worse. They were not simply monsters, they were prisoners in their own shadows. In Mordor, their master forged their purpose. "You are my dread," Sauron said, his voice carrying through the black halls. "Where armies falter, you will ride. Where men resist, you will break them. You will hunt what is mine." The Witch King, mightiest among them, lowered his head in obedience. His voice, dry as dead leaves, whispered back, "It shall be done." And so the 9 rode, across valleys, through forests, along rivers that glimmered like veins beneath the land. They carried no banners, but their presence was war enough. Fortresses surrendered at the rumor of them. Kings laid down swords without battle. Hope itself seemed to corrode when their shadows fell across a land. But the rings gave them more than fear to wield. They could sense the unseen. Whispers in council chambers reached them across leagues. The One Ring, the heart of their bondage, called to them like a beacon through mist. It was not always clear, not always near, but when its pulse quickened, their hunger sharpened. They hunted not as soldiers but as predators bound to scent. The Witch King, in one council of shadows, spread a map before them. His gaunt hand, little more than outline, traced the mountains and the rivers. "It stirs," he rasped. "Westward. Small hands carry it. We will tear apart the earth to find them." The others nodded, not with loyalty, but with compulsion. For the one was their master as much as the Dark Lord himself. And yet, even in their obedience, cracks formed. On a night of storm, the Sea Lord stood upon a cliff, watching waves crash below. Lightning split the sky, and for an instant his form flickered, not wraith, but man. He saw his reflection in the sea, the face of who he had once been. His mouth opened in a soundless cry. Then the storm passed, and the man was gone, replaced once more by the rider cloaked in terror. The Witch King saw this. He said nothing, but in the depth of his withered mind, he too remembered a crown placed upon his brow, not by darkness, but by love of his people. That memory came less often now, slipping further away each year. And still, when it did, it cut deeper than any sword. Across the world, resistance began to stir. Men and elves whispered of alliance, of blades forged in secret, of courage too stubborn to die. Small folk, overlooked by every chronicler, began to walk roads that would one day decide fates. And the 9? They moved as a storm before dawn, certain, unstoppable, terrible. But within them, beneath the armor and the shadow, something still throbbed, not hope, but grief. The faint knowledge that they were not only hunters of the ring, but victims of it. The stage was set, the world gathering its last defiance, the 9 pressing ever closer, and the shadow of Sauron growing like a wound upon the earth. The long night had begun, the great battle broke like thunder. Beneath the walls of Minas Tirith, the sky blackened as though day itself had fled. Screams and iron clashed in a storm of steel. Amid the chaos, the 9 descended, their forms like rent shadows torn loose from night. At their head rode the Witch King, crown gleaming with an unholy fire, his voice carrying across the battlefield like a verdict, despair. Horses reared and broke free. Men's hands failed upon their swords. Courage drained as if the earth itself had swallowed it. The Nazgûl did not fight as men did. They fought as inevitability, each movement eroding hope, each presence pressing like a weight upon the chest. And yet, in that choking terror, defiance sparked. A woman, armored and unyielding, stood before the Witch King. Her blade did not tremble. At her side a halfling, small enough to vanish among corpses, gripped a dagger as though it were destiny. The Nazgûl laughed, not in mirth, but in disbelief that such fragile shapes dared oppose him. "I am no man," the woman cried, her voice rising like a clarion above the ruin. Her strike cleaved prophecy itself. The Witch King staggered, a howl erupting not from his throat but from the very binding of his ring. He fell, crown shattering against the earth, and in that fall every other wraith felt it. The ghost of the dunes clutched at his chest, though he no longer had flesh to wound. For a heartbeat he saw his son, standing at the edge of a desert tent, waiting for a father who never returned. The vision seared him, unbearable in its clarity. The Sea Lord reeled upon his mount, hearing the roar of waves he had once commanded. He smelled salt, tasted brine, and remembered a ship he had sworn to guide home, but never did. The Scholar King dropped to his knees in the shadows, phantom hands pressed to invisible pages. He read the last word he had ever spoken to his people, a word he had sworn would guide them, and then it was gone, dissolving into ash. Across the field, the Nine faltered. For the first time in centuries, they felt not only Sauron's will but their own grief rising against it. The tether pulled taut, dragging them east, toward the mountain where the One still pulsed. Mount Doom bled fire into the sky. As the ring neared its end, their forms unraveled. They reached for it not with choice, but with compulsion, drawn as moths are to flame. They felt its pulse in their hollow bones, its whisper promising restoration, release, eternity. It called them by the names they had lost. But when the ring fell into the fire, the world shifted. There was no single blast, no trumpet of ending. There was a silence so profound it seemed to unmake sound itself. The tether that had bound them for ages snapped. And in that instant, the Nazgûl knew both agony and mercy. Their cloaks shriveled. Their crowns burned away. Armor dissolved into nothing. But deeper still, memory surged. Each was given, for a heartbeat, the full truth of what had been taken. The ghost of the dunes saw his son grown old without him, a line broken by absence. The Sea Lord saw his harbor empty, ships crumbled into rot. The Scholar King saw his library in ruins, his laws twisted into tyranny. It was unbearable, and yet, for the first time in uncounted years, it was theirs. The Witch King, dissolving into flame and ash, felt something even stranger. Not victory, not vengeance, but release. He remembered a voice soft, forgotten, that had once told him that rulership was not power, but service. He had betrayed that truth, and it had destroyed him. And yet, in that final second, he understood it again. And then he was gone. Across the world, the terror lifted. The silence that had pressed upon men's hearts broke like dawn. Soldiers who had cowered rose, gasping as though drowning men pulled from water. Mothers wept in the streets as the shadow receded. The Nazgûl, scourge of centuries, were no more. But they did not vanish into nothing. They vanished into memory, and memory is heavier than stone. Those who had once been kings, once been fathers, once been men, passed into legend. Their story became a wound in the world and a warning that no crown, no gift, no promise of eternity can be taken without cost. And for a brief, impossible moment, as fire consumed the ring, the Nine were free. The war ended not with triumphal horns, but with silence. When the ring fell into fire, when the Nine dissolved into ash and memory, the land itself seemed to exhale. Skies that had been iron-gray for years broke open into pale blue. Winds shifted, carrying not sulfur but the scent of rain. Rivers, once sluggish with ash, began to run clear again, as though the world had waited centuries for a wound to close. But silence is never empty. It is heavy with remembrance. In villages once abandoned, people returned to find doors still swinging from rusted hinges, fields gone wild with weeds. They worked with trembling hands, rebuilding hearths and plows, speaking in whispers of what they had survived. They did not speak of the Nine, not at first. The memory was too raw, like pressing fingers into an unhealed scar. Yet stories began to surface. A farmer swore that, on the night of the ring's destruction, he saw a shadow on the horizon pause, lift its head, and dissolve like smoke against the dawn. A soldier claimed that when his sword arm failed at Pelennor Fields, a voice, thin and sorrowful, whispered in his ear, "Run, child, run." Even among the elves, who measured memory in ages, there were murmurs that, at the moment of dissolution, the Nine had not cursed but wept. The kingdoms they once ruled were quieter now, their thrones empty. The desert lords' palaces had fallen into sand. The mountain strongholds were abandoned caverns, echoes their only inheritors. The sea lords' harbors rotted, ships broken and barnacled. The scholars' libraries lay in ruin, charred and half-buried, his laws surviving only in fragments quoted by frightened scribes. The people of those lands spoke their names less and less until they became not kings but wraiths alone, remembered for terror, not rule. That forgetting was a mercy. But it was also a tragedy. Because once, they had been men. Among the wise, debate stirred. Were the Nine villains or victims? Some said they were weak, seduced by gifts they should have refused. Others argued they had been deceived, their trust turned against them. The truth was perhaps both. But truth rarely comforts. It only lingers unresolved in the marrow of history. The elves, when pressed, would speak quietly of the forging of Celimber's regret, of the fair stranger who had hidden his darkness until it was too late. But even they could not name what passed through the Nine in their final moments, that strange flicker of memory, that brief reclaiming of self before the end. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps it mattered more than anything. And yet, for all the horror, the world learned something. In the years after, children grew up hearing not just of battles won, but of the Nine kings who had once loved their people and of the choice they made that unmade them. Mothers told the tale not as history, but as warning, beware the gift that promises too much. Fathers told it with sorrow, beware the crown that costs your soul. It was not a story of victory alone, but of cost. Of how even the greatest rulers can fall when fear outweighs love. And though their thrones lay empty, their shadows gone, the Nine lingered not as wraiths, but as memory. Memory that cut, but also guided. On some nights, when the moon hung pale and the wind carried silence across plains once darkened by their passing, travelers swore they could hear hooves. Not loud, but distant. Not near, but impossibly vast. As though the world itself had not yet forgotten. And if one listened closely, those hoofbeats were not only dreadful. Beneath the terror lay something more fragile, grief. The grief of men who had ruled, who had loved, who had once been mortal, and who, in their final unmaking, remembered. So ended the tale of the Nine. Not as heroes, not as monsters, but as a warning carved into the bones of the world. Their crowns were gone. Their rings reduced to ash. But the memory of them lingered, reminder that power untempered becomes prison, and that no man, however mighty, is immune to the weight of time. The world rebuilt. The shadow receded. But in the silence that follows a storm, there was always the echo. 9 kings. 9 rings. 9 shadows. And the choice that turned them into legend.